And welcome to another episode of Mind the Gap, Making Education Work Across the Globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner.
Hello.
So Emma, we are celebrating our first anniversary. In fact, in true style, we missed it. So we just realised that we've been doing this for over a year, and I think we're on to our 24th or 25th episode by the time this goes out. And that's pretty exciting. And we're still doing it. It's been fun, hasn't it?
It's been absolutely heaps of fun, and happy anniversary, Tom, even though we missed it. And rather fitting that first anniversary is paper, seeing as we discuss books all the time. But yeah, we've had a really great year discussing things with so many people from across the world. I've learned so much. We've had real opportunities to delve deep into kind of expert brains and get them to share their wisdom. So it's been an absolute blast. It's been brilliant. Yeah,
and we've spoken to some people in the US like Patrice Bain, which was a real joy, and Principal Kafeli, who's just an incredible character, Sonia Thompson, and just so many people. And we're going to talk later about some of our most recent episodes. So we're going to carry on, and we're going to get better at trying to cue each other in. We always laugh about the fact that we never know when we're going to stop, but we do our best. But in this particular episode, we're going to just talk to each other about some of the things that we've been thinking about recently, and share some of our own thoughts. So Emma, I'll start with you. What have you been thinking about recently?
I've been thinking about feedback a lot based on a blog post that you wrote, Tom. I read your blog post, and then I've been reading another book alongside it. And I was just interested in your thoughts in that post about written versus verbal feedback. I don't know whether you want to explain what the post was about.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I was saying that I feel like written feedback after a lesson is largely a waste of time. And I was thinking about this, that I used to do this as a head teacher and a senior leader. I'd go into some lessons, which were planned or not planned, but mainly planned, and talk to and sort of observe the lesson. And I'd have my laptop or a clipboard with me or something. And then the process was to sort of produce a report which kind of evaluated that lesson. And then I'd sometimes find that quite an onerous task, and I wanted to do it well. So I'd go home in the evening and get my laptop open. And I'd spend a couple of hours crafting these well-written feedback notes based on my scribbled notes to try to communicate to the teacher a nice balance of saying some nice things and giving them some pithy, insightful things they might work on. And sometimes I'd write that without even speaking to them at that time. I might then meet them. Sometimes the process was to even send them that by email and then meet them afterwards. And now I just think that was weird. Like, sort of, not only was it a massive workload thing for me, but I was thinking, what was it like to be that teacher receiving this long thing about, half an hour of a lesson, or maybe even a full lesson, but where they didn't even get a chance to tell me in their own words what they were trying to do, what they felt was going well, their sense of the issues they were struggling with in their own mind at the time. It was all like, I'm the knower, I'm the expert, I know stuff, let me tell you what I think. And to me, it just seems like a perverse thing that I would do that without talking to the teacher first. So that's the first thing. And then the second step of that is, having now realised that, I even think that if we're going to have a conversation first, which seems entirely normal, who's the best person to write something down afterwards? Well, it isn't me, it's the teacher. It's like, well, good, we've had a discussion, we've come to some shared understanding. Why don't you just jot down the key things you think you're going to now do, and then that's job done. And my role has been to facilitate that conversation. So that's my thinking. I mean, it's an embedded part of my practice for a long, long time, that lesson observation reports were the things that leaders do. And now I just think it's an absolute nonsense. So what are your take on that?
I agree, and it's interesting you say about the other person taking the notes as well, because when I was in headship, whenever we used to give feedback on lessons, I'd obviously have my notes, but the person who was receiving the feedback as well would take notes, and then we would sort of compare them and say, are we taking away the same messages that we both agree on? But I was thinking of it more in the grand scheme of things, in terms of, if you're a senior leader in a school, you're trying to build up that picture of usualness, aren't you? That's why you do your kind of lesson observations or learning walks, is because you want to build up a picture of the usualness of that person's practice, or the usualness of the practice across your school. And if you're only taking these tiny little snapshots of individual lessons, that's completely useless as well. It's like taking a Polaroid snap of something and saying that that's the entire representation of somebody's teaching career, rather than like a family album approach of, you know, this was this month and this was that month, and, you know, this is the usual picture that you'd see. So I do think lesson observations and learning walks in their kind of historical context are of such limited use, in terms of they just provide that snapshot. There's the whole power dynamic going on. There's the whole workload thing of, like you say, kind of documenting the narration of what you saw in this big extended like play script of what happened. And then that other person having to sort of sit meekly on the other side of it and say, well, okay, because they were so focused on the actual teaching and learning, they weren't necessarily seeing what you were seeing. It's a completely different viewpoint. So I do think that lesson observations and learning walks, we're at a crossroads with them, where I think that how they used to be used, used to be formatted, used to be structured, I don't think they're of any use going forward necessarily in terms of...
I think with learning walks, which means when you're walking around a lesson, I feel like if you've got a good process where teachers are involved in sort of coaching conversations, or just, even if you don't call it that, but say a process where when you're observed by somebody in a sort of formal way, you sit down with them, talk about it, and that's part of a cycle. I do think leaders can walk around school all day long. In fact, they think they should, and you're just seeing typicality. I mean, I went into a school last week and I observed in 9 different teachers, and I wouldn't have used those moments to feed back to those teachers, because I felt like that was just me getting a feel for the school. It was my first day in the school. I'm going back there next month. But on that day, I was just getting a sense of things. And I learned quite a lot about the school, and I spoke to the leaders. So that has value, definitely. And I'm seeing some of the challenges and all of that.
It's where those people are having these lesson observations where it's set in the calendar, you know, somebody's coming in at 11 o'clock on the dot on that day, and they're going to give you that feedback. And so as a teacher, you end up pouring all of your life resources into that one moment, because you're so desperate to show your class and your own practice in its best light, that it ends up becoming so high, you know, the stakes are so high that it becomes completely unusual, not representative of your practice. And you might absolutely smash it out of the park and do the most wonderful teaching ever, but we've all also taught those lessons of which we shall never speak again.
Well, that's the thing, is that you don't want to motivate people to have sort of massive peaks of practice, as if you can sort of nail it all on the day. You're much better off trying to motivate people to sort of grind out high quality routines. So let's look at this a little bit more. I feel like, so that it's not that, say, people don't need feedback. So all the, you know, research around a good professional development and any kind of, say, sports coaching and so on, you know, athletes, performers, people need feedback, because you can't always generate it from within, because you're not always aware of all the things that are going on, and you don't necessarily even have the expertise, the full, especially when you're beginning, to know all the possibilities. So it's the way it's done. So this is the other thing, that it's not just some sort of moral thing about, I don't think it's the right thing to do. I just think it doesn't work very well. So even if I thought it was fine professionally to write a long report on someone, it's just pragmatically, it's a waste of time, because so little of the subtlety in my head of describing what I've seen translates into the teacher's head of what they think they then need to do next. And that's the thing I found. I mean, it's written about in literature, but it's definitely true from my experience, that like this school I was in recently, the character of the teachers was a massive factor when I discussed their teaching afterwards. So I was meeting them all afterwards to talk about their teaching. I wasn't there to give them feedback. And some of the teachers were kind of like a little bit glass half empty. You know, they were kind of, problem this, well, the problem with that is, yeah, well, you know, that would be nice, but we were never that. And then there was everything seemed difficult. So I was having to think, how do I crack them? And I was sort of saying, yeah, I know, it's tough, isn't it? Must be so hard. But you are doing quite a lot of really good stuff, though. So maybe if you just focus on that, and having to kind of get them on side with me a bit. Whereas another guy, he was like, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. He was like peppering me with suggestions. I was thinking, whoa. Like, hold it, you know, and those are those characters. That's what's so great about teachers. They're so individual, and I love that. But it doesn't mean me crafting my feedback in my terms is totally pointless when the two different people are so different in their mindset. Do you know what I mean?
That's you couldn't have teed that up more beautifully, Tom, for the segue into this book, which is Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well, which was a recommendation by or from Catherine Morgan and Abby Bayford, and Abby, who we've had on previously, who recommended this read. And I think Nimish has been dipping into this one as well. But it kind of flips the whole feedback dynamic onto, yes, it's important to give feedback well and to understand how to give feedback well, but actually it's also about knowing how to receive feedback really effectively and really well, and recognizing why sometimes feedback that you receive is really quite ouchy for one reason or another. It doesn't land properly. You don't think it's right. You just think it's it's not the right. It's not either not the right time or not the right thing or not from the right person. So it unpicks actually how to receive feedback really, really well, and why you feel the way you do sometimes when you receive feedback. And I think that's hugely illuminating then for anybody who is giving feedback to have read this, to actually say, what might actually be going through this person's head and why, and what can I do to mitigate that, to make my feedback so much more targeted and impactful. But I do think what you said, Tom, about conversation being so important is such a key factor of it. It's rather than this kind of transactional thing, there's your feedback, there's your target, see you later. It's about that conversation between the feedback giver and the feedback receiver, but both understanding not only the different roles, but the different viewpoints, the different reasons for them giving the feedback in that way at that moment. So I just think it's a really interesting read, and it's a brilliant recommendation from Catherine and Abby, and I'm on my second read through now of it.
Who's the author again? Remind me of that.
The authors are Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen, and they're of the Harvard Negotiation Project, and they also co-authored the book Difficult Conversations. So they're very skilled in the art of having those prickly conversations with people.
I think I needed to read that book because I think I'm rubbish at receiving feedback, and people have told me that before. They're sort of scared to give me any because I don't react very well to it.
Well, I read it, and apparently there's 3 triggers for feedback if you receive it negatively. It's something to do with truth, it's something to do with relationship, or it's something to do with your own identity. And I was reading it going, oh yeah. That's so true.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, I have a view of. I wrote a blog about feedback about, say, one-off events, because I feel like, in fact, last week I did an online conference keynote to a conference in Asia, and the organizer told all the participants before I started talking to remind them to use their app to rate the session. Because that's what they do. So I start off my talk by saying, I'm actually going to say something, which is that even though you've been asked to rate my session, that it won't make any difference because I'm never going to do this talk again. And actually, I think it's kind of rude. I actually said this. I think it's kind of rude to talk to some professionals and say you're going to judge me on the way I present my information, because it doesn't really make any difference to anything. What really matters is whether 6 months down the line you've actually used any of this information. So that you've had an impact on your children, because a professional discussion we're having. And if I was working with you over time and we had a relationship and I knew who you were and we trusted each other, then I might be open to hearing your comments. But as a bunch of strangers, it kind of doesn't really matter to me what you say, because how can I possibly do anything with it? So we had this whole conversation about feedback needs to be about the next time you do something. It's no point giving people a review. What's the point? So it has to be in the cycle. So you can say, right, what are we going to do next? Because really that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? It's about actions, which is why I love my favorite go-to resource on feedback in teaching is, and I hold it up for the people watching on YouTube, this classic book, Leverage Leadership by Paul Bambrick Santoyo. I think it's so good. I come back to this chapter 3 all the time. And he has this great way of framing the feedback. I know lots of schools use this. And there are a couple of things in there I'll focus on. One of them is the need to provide precise praise. And I get people to think about this. It's a really interesting thing to think about. Like when I about to talk to someone about anything, this is the thing I think about hardest. How can I say something good, which doesn't sound naff, like, hey, that was really great, or I really loved that lesson, which doesn't really tell them anything except about my feelings. So you think, I need to say something specific, like, hey, wasn't it fantastic the way Jennifer responded to those questions? You really got her to give you a really good answer. And the discipline to say something like that, which is actually quite useful and more specific to the thing they're working on, is it takes a bit of thought. And I really like that. Is that something that you do automatically?
It's also in this book because they talk about data and they talk about emotional data and actual data and the things that you, like you just saying, oh, I loved it or I liked it. That's the wrong thing to be focusing on. So it unpicks what we mean by data when we're looking at something, both in terms of impact, in terms of human emotion. It's really interesting. And it talks about how to get, like you were saying, from that kind of generic thing right down to the really pinpointed, fine-grained detail of actually what you're trying to say. Because the other thing that it doesn't matter what you say, the person who's listening to it might still take away something completely different. And unless you've been so specific with that data, then nothing's going to happen, or you're going to get that kind of lethal mutation of the wrong thing happening. Yeah. With, oh, but Tom Sherrington said I needed to do that. So you're like, oh.
I used to have this problem a lot with sort of very sort of bland just affirmation. Someone comes to your office and they've got an idea, and you want to say, you want to encourage them, so you say, yeah, that's really interesting. You know, that's interesting. You know, let's think that's something we should think about. And they go back to their office and say, hey, Tom said I can go ahead with that whole project. I'm thinking, well, that's not what I said. That's what I want. That's what you wanted me to say, and that's what you heard me say. But I was just sort of not being negative about it. But I wasn't. And you realise that that's almost inevitable, so you have to rethink. The other Banbricks-Montoya thing I love is this idea of the action step. And for me, this language needs to be. This is why I think teachers need to write their own, because it's their action steps. So and their action steps to solve a problem, which depersonalizes. So the problem in a lesson is that Michael doesn't know how to use the sentence structure that you've just been modeling. That's the problem. You might be working your socks off. I can't even really fault you for it, because it's just hard to get Michael to do that. And anyone would find it hard, but it's still the problem. So the problem we still got is, how do we get Michael to be able to do what some of the other children can do? Let's focus on that. And that's the problem. And it's not about you being good or bad or effective or ineffective. It's about it's a reality of the room. It's complicated. And that to me is a real, sounds dumb now to me to even admit this, but it's like a revelation that's the way to approach the whole business, rather than, is this teacher good?
And the other thing is, you can, because you're dealing with young people, and those young people change, across a year. And if you're teaching in secondary, you're going to teach multiple classes, or in primary, you're going to be teaching multiple subjects during the day. What works really well in one particular context, where you look like a great teacher, will not work in another context, and it will make you look like a less great teacher. So I think that mindset of actually saying, what's in front of me that I need to solve and how can I attack that, is a much healthier way of looking at developing your practice than thinking, am I good? Because the analogy that I always use with my early career teachers, especially when we're moving from initial teacher education through to being a newly qualified teacher, is that you're no longer the picture in the frame, you're the frame around the picture. As in, when you're initially training, all eyes are on you. Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do the other? But actually, when you move into being in your NQT year, it's not about you anymore necessarily. It's about the impact that you have on the children in the frame, rather than you being in the frame to pass your initial year. So I think that having that frame around the picture focus and thinking, what problem is in my picture that I need to solve, rather than I'm in the picture looking marvelous, is a kind of a useful way that I work with my early career teachers to think about it. It's not you, it's what we can do to help solve the picture to help solve the problem in the picture.
So that's interesting. That is probably a good way to then to start talking about Abby, who we interviewed recently, wasn't it? So she was, I mean, you know her more than me, but it was the first time I've really spoken to her. And then we both did an event with her to launch this fantastic book, A Letter to My NQT Self. Is that the right title?
Yeah, yeah.
And she's an amazing enthusiast for teacher development. And she said, "Here's a really nice idea." And she read out some of the letters. And to people who aren't aware of the book, I mean, you know it better than I do. So tell people what the premise of her book was, to remind everyone.
It was a collection of letters from experienced, established, and in some cases relatively newly qualified colleagues. A collection of letters that they wish they could have had in their NQT year. So it's kind of like, if you could go in a time machine and go and talk to your NQT self, what would you want to say to them? But it's collating those into one complete set, which could be used as, you know, a lovely kind of gift entrance to the profession for somebody to kind of say, we're all in it together, but also have this other layer of actually being a really useful tool for if you're going to do some kind of coaching conversations or mentoring conversations, where if there's an issue or problem to solve in the picture, you could use these letters to really unpick and explore and support an early career colleague as a kind of a conversation opener. But all of the proceeds from the book are going to charity as well to support what's the helpline called, Tom? I've gone blank.
Well, we have to put it in the notes underneath. I can't remember either, but it's a helpline to support teachers who
support teachers. I want to say all I can think of is EduGive, which is your thing. That's the one I've got in my mind. But no, Abby's book, I think it's doing great things out there. It's really, really popular with ITT cohorts, with mentors, with students, and it's just a delight to talk to her, because, like you say, she's completely committed to teacher development and people development. So not just teachers within her organisation, but everybody who works and contributes in their organisation. So, yeah, absolutely love talking to Abby. And we also spoke to John and Jonny, didn't we, Tom?
Yeah, so their episode was a bit of a smash in terms of our ratings, and I think it's because you have two people who are, well known for, sort of putting forward a fairly strongly principled stance about how head teachers should behave, the sorts of schools that people ought to run, but they actually do follow through, and so their book, Putting Staff First, is just a really good summary of a whole ton of ideas about how to run a school around professional development and appraisal and all sorts of other things, but where you really are saying, let's treat people well, let's treat people with some kind of professional kind of respect. But it goes beyond that. It's also about making the schools better for everyone, for the children, everything, and keeping staff motivated and so on. And there's so many great ideas in there. But yeah, I mean, and I can't remember, Jonny got quite angry. He gets quite wound up about other head teachers in a sort of locality where you're aware that they compete with you. They do that trash talking thing of we're saying we're better than the local schools, or they do things like dumping children into the community that they've excluded, and they take no responsibility for where they go. And those people do exist in the system.
Yeah, and I think that's why so many people really love listening to John and Jonny, because they are such a voice of reason and warmth and calm and just goodness, basically. I'm never knowingly more than 6 feet from a copy of Putting Staff First, because yes, it's kind of all about ethical leadership, and yes, it's all about kind of treating people really well, but actually within it are some really concrete, beautiful pro formas and steps and advice that leaders can actually take and implement in their schools tomorrow. And the section on early career teaching is absolutely outstanding. It's brilliant, and I referenced it today in some kind of in some NPQH work that we were doing. And it's just an absolute gift of a book. And I think Jonny's quite right to get cross on occasion, because although teaching's great and the leadership landscape is great, there are, like you say, there are a few trash talkers and a few people doing underhand things in education. And I think it's great that people like Jonny and John are standing up and saying, hang on a minute, this isn't cricket, is it?
No. Although, I feel like that sense of a profession, being generally run by principled people is something which I always find is the case. And we might have disagreements about the sorts of things that we should do, or different perspectives on that. But there is that sense of being a community of schools supporting a community of people and their children. And the more school leaders, I feel, act in that way, that they recognise that they're custodians of a kind of organisation that serves a whole community, I think that's better. And I think sometimes it's a PR thing, isn't it? I mean, it does, it's painful, isn't it, when people sort of big up their inspection record and then use it in a competitive sense, because we still do have essentially a competitive marketplace approach to education, where you want children to come to your school so that it's full and you've got, a cohort of children which is going to be successful. And sometimes that literally means at the expense of the other schools. It's a bizarre scenario, but that is our system. And it's sort of explicitly competitive. It's awful, really.
It is, but doing what's right and doing what is easy, Tom, is not necessarily the same thing, is it?
I used to say this a lot when I used to be the head of a selective school, and people would say to me, in what ways would you say your school is better than such and such another school? And you'd be asked that question directly in front of a whole audience of people. And you have to say, well, I'm here sort of in the way you talk. I am trying to project the values of the school to say, well, I wouldn't say the school is better than those schools. Loads of children do really well at those schools and they come out with incredible results. I felt to say that all the time. But what I found, ironically, was that the more you do that, the more people kind of still wanted to come to yours. It's almost like, you don't have to come here. You don't want to. There's loads of other good schools, and actually, that's true. But and I do think people need to be honest about that and saying that supporting each other actually doesn't even do you any harm. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
So that was good. I mean, and people obviously can see those episodes. It's Abby Bayford and Jonny Uttley and John Tomsett. That was absolutely fantastic. So, I mean, moving ahead. I mean, I actually was going to say a little bit about this thing, which I'm sort of, by the time this goes out, I'll have published it, which is a blog called something about the dynamism of the teaching community. I just think it's amazing. It's buzzing. I feel that it's so amazing. And recently I've been to a couple of places sort of breaking out of my own lockdown. I spent 2 days in Wakefield talking to teachers on one day and teaching assistants on the next day, a whole day training. And I went to a school in Leicester, and I've spoken to whole groups of teachers across my area in North London. Lots of sessions talking to primary head teachers about their professional learning, and I just was totally blown away by all of it. I just think, wow, aren't we so lucky? We've got these fantastic, principled, enthusiastic, knowledgeable people. And despite all of it, despite the lockdowns, all of that, and in secondary, despite all the fact that teachers are acting like exam boards, writing grades, I just feel like there's a kind of enthusiasm and a buzz, which I just don't think we've had as good as this before. I really don't. And so I don't know what you think about it, but that is definitely something I experience. I feel like we're in a really good place at the moment, and hopefully that will carry people through into the autumn term and beyond.
I think it's the gathering of momentum around professional learning that's been the real shift. And that managing to keep that momentum going during the pandemic, during lockdown, and now during all the myriad changes and pulls on people's time and the ridiculous things that workloads that schools are having to deal with. I still think, like you say, there's this kind of flickering, bubbling excitement of this professional learning, and it's going right from kind of early career all the way through into leadership. There's so many more people doing sort of masters in leadership. There's so many people through like the apprenticeship levy. There's so many people excited about the new early career framework. So many schools or MATs putting together really coherent programs of professional development. People really excited about engaging with professional development. And I think that the fact that we had to move online and people had to explore professional learning in different ways has kind of really reignited people's appetite for learning. And I think I think the momentum is gathering pace, and I think that's really exciting, really exciting.
Yeah, I think that is the key reason. So I feel like it's a number of things. There's the kind of evidence engagement. There's the books, the blogs, the events, the webinars, and there's so many things. Like we're going to be speaking to Nimish Ladd coming up soon. So for me, he's a classic example of someone who's. The reason I asked him to get involved with that was because I just saw him as someone who, for me, captures the spirit of the whole profession. He's just totally enthusiastic and he's knowledgeable. And so he's writing a book about Arthur Shimomura's Marge whole brain model of learning. And Dan Willingham, who is like the sort of absolute legend of cognitive science, has written the foreword for that book. So you've got Nimish and Dan and in the same book, and to me, I just think that's just gold. That's an example. So there's the evidence engagement, and I feel what we've happened is that we've gone through this hump of people sort of saying, "Hey, there's research out there, and what's this thing called Rosenshine's principles?" and debating it or reacting against it, and saying, "What is this?" To the point where we're kind of saying, "Yeah, we know it's there. Let's just use it," and that's what I think is exciting. We're past that initial awareness raising bit quite a lot. And the same as with curriculum. So when our inspector at Ofsted is telling schools to sort of basically get their act together on curriculum, everyone goes into hyperdrive on ticking boxes and producing intense statements. And I feel like that initial yikes moment has passed. And now we're into a more mature kind of like, okay, let's just do this for the long term. And it's more steady, it's more mature, it's more intelligent. And again, that's exciting. So and then people are talking about things like the early career framework, and which is the fact that it's universal, like the fact that everyone's having to talk about it in across England means that it's bringing people into kind of a shared space. So let's talk about this stuff. Well, how do we teach? Even if people have had good programs in the past, it's made people refresh their ideas. So all of these things, I just feel are part of the whole spirit.
It's interesting you say about the UK teachers. I saw a tweet today with some of the early career walkthrough stuff, and somebody had tweeted in America, "Every early career teacher in America, look at this." There was a tweet, actually, and I'll have to see if I can find it. I'll send it to you, Tom, but it did not make me laugh because I was thinking, actually, it's not just the UK that's kind of feeling like this. I was on a call this morning with colleagues in Ottawa, Qatar, Australia, and everybody was kind of on the same page in the same moment about this excitement about learning and reading and developing the profession. And I think, again, with the move to online a lot of the time, that's really opened up the kind of quality of conversation that we can have, because it's bringing in a lot of more of this kind of international perspective as well, to really hold up our own practice against what's happening in the world and compare and contrast and pull together all the really, really strong bits. So I think the sharing of practice from across the world, again, is partly what's reigniting the profession as well, to say, look, it's really exciting what they do in this country, or, I found this from there, and it's, interesting.
I do think so. I mean, it's like, so there's so many different ways of accessing that. So I think things like webinars and podcasts, and okay, again, I think this is like an inevitable sort of hump. People start, as soon as there's quite a few podcasts, people will say, "Oh God, who's got time to listen to podcasts?" You think, well, mate, you don't need to listen to it. Like, no one's making you do it. And as books, too many books. Well, okay, but just read the ones you want to read. But the fact is that more and more I go into schools and teachers have read that and they have accessed things. And some of these books are not just some ivory tower researcher writing about education as if they've never been in a classroom. There's a kind of recognition that you need to relate the stuff to people who are doing the job. Anyway, so I just think it's good. And I'm not saying it's people will talk about things like pay and conditions and workload and all those other factors, which I'm not even really referencing in saying this, because those things will, you compare in different ways. It's just the spirit of it. And I do think the online community, sometimes people say it's like a bubble. But that's what I think I'm noticing, is that when I go to places, there's just more out there of people who are not on Twitter or whatever, who are still coming into the kind of frame of talking about memory and learning and debating curriculum content, even if they've never been involved in a Twitter spat over it. They're thrashing this stuff out round a table, and I see that, and I love it. I just think it's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think that things like people doing all these masters and people doing the new, MPQs. It's all going to be permeating through the profession, which is really, really exciting. Right from early on, right from like ITT, initial teacher training, all the way through. I think it's a brilliant time to be involved in research. And like you say, there are other big problems rumbling along that will never go away, like pay and conditions.
As long as it's sort of in people's minds that there's a big debate about the catch up and extra hours and who's going to do all that. But we just have to keep focusing on. I still feel there's so much mileage in great training, great curriculum design, following through on what we planned. And it's not about extras, it's about embedding and deepening the stuff we're already doing. Now, let's tell people, I think, that to wrap up with this episode, you and I have just finished the project. What I love about this project is that it was something which I felt I needed to do with my WalkThrus buddy, Oliver. But then I asked you to do it. And so actually you've done all the work, which is great. So tell people what it is that you have just finished doing.
Which I blithely originally said, this would take me about an afternoon, and then I actually started doing it. Yeah, it's the early career framework, which is going to be the statutory entitlement for all early career teachers as of September for 2 years of training that they can access. So it's not an assessment tool, it's a statutory entitlement to training during the first 2 years of their career. And there are 8 standards, and in these 8 standards, there are things that they need to learn about, and then there are things that they need to learn how to do. And Tom quite rightly said, it'd be really interesting to map the WalkThrus against these, see how they match up. So I sat there with the early career framework and both copies of WalkThrus for a week or two, flicking through and matching them all up, because I was already using them with all of my ITT and early career cohorts anyway. But now they're all fully matched. WalkThrus 1 and WalkThrus 2 matched against the 8 standards within the early career framework. And Oliver has worked some kind of amazing magic and hyperlinked them all to PowerPoints and videos and workbooks and notes and handouts and things. So when's it going live, Tom?
Well, I think by the time people are listening to this, it will already be there. So we made it. Oliver made the graphics side of it, and I sat there and hyperlinked them all because I feel like I had to do something. But I have to say, I think it was really interesting because this is, I think, like you say, it's statutory, and ours is just a sort of thing which we just wrote off, literally with no content. And I think what's interesting is that this is what showed you there's a kind of alignment here, that a totally different set of people wrote that early career framework document to me and Oliver. And yet the alignment is high, even though it's not total, which tells you that there is a kind of consensus around things like behaviour management, research-informed teaching and professional standards, which is healthy, isn't it? It's not so aligned that it's like group, it's sort of, there's no scope for diversity or diverse approaches. But it just shows you that teaching isn't so kind of unknown or undescribable that we'd all come up with a totally different set of ways of describing it. That hasn't been the case, has it?
No, definitely not. And it was really interesting to go through with kind of my primary hat on, but also, I don't know if I've ever told you this, Tom, I did a weird course where I trained in Key Stage 2-3. So I was like, went in with my primary hat on and then a very old, dusty secondary hat on a little bit. And I was actually thinking there is so much crossover here in terms of practice. Both, I could see this working in, a year 9 science lesson as much as I could see it working in a year 2 literacy lesson. So it threw up as well the potential for conversation between, much more conversation, cross-phase as well, about what we do for our children in terms of our provision and how we could potentially align that a little bit more across the year groups that we teach as well. So that was one interesting thing that I found out. But it also threw up the fact that there are some kind of Uber WalkThrus as well, the ones that just keep coming up again.
Like modelling and scaffolding, and I saw that list. So different concepts and small steps. So when I was in the school in Leicester last week, one of the sort of bits of the day I loved was in the early years, so going to the foundation. So you're in a sort of essentially like a kindergarten, but nursery or / reception, different classes. And in one of the classes, I think it was the reception class, I had to sort of play shop with these children. It was fantastic. You know, I had to choose the flavour of ice cream. I had to say which size cone I wanted, and they were behind this shop which had all this sort of plastic stuff, and they had to stick, and they had to do the language of the money, how much it would cost. They weren't adding up money, but it was all pretend money, and they had coins and giving me change, and there's a whole and this was all something which they had described through sequencing concepts and small steps, and I just thought this was great. And there's so much thought go into it, especially if you looked around the room, like every other sort of group of 3 children was doing something completely different, all coordinated and kind of sort of low level coordinated. I just thought, wow, this is exhausting. I was tired just being in there for 10 minutes.
It is. Foundation colleagues are very, very special and have the stamina, superhuman stamina. But it was a real pleasure, a real great opportunity to kind of cross-match all of those walkthroughs. And if you are working with early career colleagues, there's a real alignment now, and something practical and concrete that you could give to kind of bring the early career framework statements to life, to say, look, this is what it looks like. You know, this is what it sounds like. This is how it's structured, because it can be really quite difficult to articulate exactly what we mean by all of those statements. So it was great to see that there was so much alignment between the walkthroughs. And thank you, Tom, for asking me to do it, because it was I would say it was fun, but it was really worthwhile.
It's something we've in the walkthroughs team made available to anyone. So it's just on our website. You can download it, and for people who are part of our subscription, there's a kind of more kind of animated version of it. But so thank you very much. And so we've got some great guests coming up soon, going into the summer, and which was really great. So I think with a year under our belts, Emma, we're due a celebration at some point. We'll have to get together. But thank you to everyone listening. Thank you to listening to this episode. Thank you to Ross, our amazing producer, who's in the background all the time. And see you, everybody, soon. Thank you. This is Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe.